So we often have to resample, which is calculating new raster cell values from old ones. We do this every time we do a map projection, or almost every time, because we're going from one orientation of one grid, and often we're changing the grid cell size, to another orientation in another grid in a different coordinate system. And we often have to do this when we want to combine data from different sources. They might have a different cell size and not be aligned correctly. So an example here are some Landsat data. It's land cover data that's originally raster. It's a measure of the reflectance of energy in various bands, and it gets converted into categorical types. One is water, and two is dense urban, etc. And that comes at a 30-meter resolution. And I might want to combine that with 10-meter resolution elevation data. And so I have to either sample the elevation data to 30 meters that matches the land cover data, or subsample down the land cover data to a higher resolution elevation data to combine them. And when they don't align perfectly, so you get these bits and edges, some cells for the elevation fall entirely within, but some are split between. There are decisions I have to make about how I'm going to combine these data sets. Now, there's a lot of image processing that does things called resampling. It's not the same as the resampling we're doing here. In a lot of image processing, we don't really care about the values, it's the look. And so it can change things in funny ways. This is an image sharpening. And so resampling, which is often called some kind of image sharpening, isn't the sort of thing that we want to apply. You gotta be careful if you have a set of tools that you don't use the image processing tools on your raster data, especially if you have categorical data or ordinal data. It changes them to values that make no sense. But even if you have interval ratio data, you get these weird artifacts, blocking and enhanced edges and all sorts of things that maybe make the image look better, but ruin your data. So you have to be careful. Here's the kind of problem we might have. If I have these black squares as the original data and the pink or red squares as the target, how do I combine these data? Now, if it's interval ratio data, numbers that hold a value that's relative along a real number scale, usually it's some sort of median or mean or averaging or weighted averaging of them. If it's ordinal data or data that's categorical, 1 is water and 9 is grass, then there are other ways I might want to resample. So for averaging, I might get something like this, right? These are all 6s in the average to 6. These numbers average to 5s. That's somewhere between in these 2.5. But again, there's resampling ambiguity when I'm using, if these are categorical data. So sometimes in many systems, I can pick a value I want to hold dominance, like 1 over 2 over 3 over 4. So if there's any 1s, it gets a 1 in the output. Other times I might just say, well, take whatever is nearest the center cell. Of course, if you have perfect alignment, then it would be a random draw. Another thing about resampling and about almost any analysis is typically the null holds value. So if all of the cells have values except one which is a null, the output will be a null. That isn't always the case. You can usually set a switch that says ignore any nulls. But you have to be careful in resampling and really in any processing with raster data, how the processing reacts to nulls. So if you have numbers, this could be an average or median. If you have just categorical labels, then you typically have to say how you're going to process when you have a mixed set of labels. Raster resampling always occurs, or almost always occurs, when we're doing a projection, and with a projection or reprojection, we get cells that don't align nicely. And so we have to deal with this problem of sort of multiple overlap in the cells when they're the same size and when they're different size. You get portions of cells, and you can say, well, I would average any of these, but then this has the same weight as this, so this cell, it's only partially there, and that sometimes doesn't make sense. So we have resampling methods that are distance-weighted methods. And one of them is just take the center cell, whatever is the nearest to the center cell. So the value that's nearest, this nearest neighbor, says, well, look, this one is closest to the center cell. The center of this is closest to the center of our output, and so that's what I'm going to assign. Another is a distance-weighted averaging of the 4 nearest cells. It's called a bilinear interpolation. And the third that's commonly used is a cubic convolution. Now, there's all sorts of them out there, but in reality, we usually use nearest neighbor or bilinear interpolation for most of our resampling that goes on. Nearest neighbor is pretty obvious. I'll walk through a bilinear interpolation. Basically, it's a distance-weighted averaging. So if I have 4 cells that are going to contribute to the output value, which corresponds to this location, I first average along one axis and then average those averages along the other axis. And so I'll take my value here at Z4 and my value at Z3, and I'd say, look, I'll start at Z4, and I'll take Z3 minus Z4 times the distance divided by the total possible distance. And you can see how this makes sense, right? So if the distance is all the way over at 5, right, the D1 here is 5 is the cell, that ends up being the C over C, so that's 1, and so it's Z4 plus Z3 minus Z4, so it just ends up at Z3. If the value here is 0, if this distance is 0, then I just assign the Z4 value, right? Because this value here is 0 if the distance is 0. So if the points coincide here, I just take this value. If it coincides with this, I just take this value, and then I weight it in between, sort of sliding along this trajectory. And it's the same thing for here, right? Same calculation for the Z upper, right? But it's Z1 and Z2 that I use instead of Z3 and Z4, but I get this same calculation. And then I just do the same thing again for the Z upper and the Z bottom, averaging along them. So the Z out becomes a value that's weighted by the distance and the height. You know, a really high value, even if it's far away, is going to have impact, but it's going to be ameliorated by being far away. And so we interpolate bilinearly in our resampling to get new output values that are the best average of the information we had in the original cells. Now, you've got to be careful if you go across really large changes in size, let's say a 1 meter to a 10 meter resolution or a 10 meter to a 500 meter resolution, because the averaging is across very large distances and you get weird artifacts. But we usually don't do that. Just bear that in mind in case you ever have the urge to do that, that it might not be the best choice to use something like bilinear interpolation. Okie doke.